Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm Jen, one of your co-hosts for today, and I am joined by one of my glorious colleagues. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Melissa, and I'm feeling very sleuthy today for this story.
Excellent. And Melissa and I are here with the author of a fantastic children's series that we both just had such a blast reading. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Tim Collins, and I'm going to talk about Sherlock Bones and the Case of the Crown Jewels, which is the first in a new book series aimed at around about the 7 to 10-year-old category. And it's a detective series, as you might guess from the title, and it mixes text, sort of traditional storytelling, with puzzles. So the readers of the book could take a break from the story and try and crack the puzzles if they want, as they're reading through it. You don't have to crack the puzzles to go on with the story. They're just it's just a mixture of the two things, really.
They're so much fun. We read the first two, and it's such a delight. Before we get into the books themselves, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about like how you came to writing children's book, because apart from the series, you're incredibly prolific as well. So if you could talk a little bit about your writing career and maybe how it brought you to this project.
Well, I started by writing non-fiction humor books in the noughties, which were a bigger category when there was a lot of physical bookshops around, because it's the kind of thing you would pick up from a counter of a bookshop rather than something you would necessarily seek out on Amazon. So I was doing quite a lot of those non-fiction humor gift titles, and then I switched in. Round about the time of the Twilight craze, I did a sort of humorous vampire book, which was published in America as Notes from a Totally Lame Vampire. And again, I was kind of just going in for the humor angle with that, but then I got quite hooked into the fictional side of it. So it started off, it was going to be more of a parody of Twilight, and then we forgot all about that, and then it became its own thing, really. So I really enjoyed doing that, and just wanted to do more of it, really. I mean, I'd not written a lot of fiction before, but I really like writing children's fiction, not least because you can switch genres all the time. I mean, if you write adult fiction, you really have to read your market and know genres. But in children's is the genre, so you're allowed to switch between sort of fantasy and humorous horror, like I did, and now detective stories.
I love that you branched out. Obviously, Sherlock Bones is a play on the very obvious Sherlock Holmes, but how did you decide to go for this particular direction of twisting something so classic for children's? And were you a fan of Sherlock Holmes to begin with?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, I was a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. I mean, whenever there's an element of parody, it's always because it's always a love letter, isn't it? It's always because you're a huge fan of the original thing. I used to walk home via Baker Street sometimes and see the plaque on 221B Baker Street for Sherlock Holmes. It's the only fictional character, as far as I know, that gets his own blue plaque in London. And even in Baker Street Tube Station as well, they have some of the stories illustrated on the platform. So it feels like, as I was walking around that bit of London, it really feels like part of the heritage. And so I love reading all the stories, and especially love things like Hound of the Baskervilles, where it took on this atmospheric gothic feel to it. I will just I will generally find myself doing sort of humorous versions of things that I'm a big fan of. Just if you read enough of it, it starts to happen, really, doesn't it? And of course, animal fantasy is a great way of doing these things for children. It lets them know they're in a kind of a quite humorous world, and they all have a lot of awareness of Sherlock Holmes, as I found going into schools, and they may be too young to have read the books, or some of the text might be a bit difficult for them at that age, but they're all very aware of Sherlock Holmes, and aware, a lot of them as well, aware of the relationship between Watson and Holmes. So it must filter down to them through parodies, or just the way that some parts of popular culture just live on, and you seem to sort of grow up knowing them, really. Like, I remember my son doing the Jaws theme when he was about 3. I thought, where's he heard that from? It just maybe we're inherited in these things in our brains. They're such a hardwired part of popular culture now.
Yeah, that's so true. It's I guess children acquire so much just through sort of osmosis of hearing, the things that the adults around them are talking about, or things that are on TV or that they hear around. I don't know if this is an overthinking question or an underthinking question, but did you specifically choose the dog cat dynamic in order to sort of like color their dynamic or their relationship?
It was more driven by pun than anything else, to be honest, just because Sherlock Bones had to be a dog. But I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. I guess cats don't always get a great representation in children's books and films. Dogs tend to come a little bit better out of the as in the film Cats and Dogs. Dogs tend to come a bit better out of it, and cats are always seen as having a slightly evil side to them. But it doesn't really come across in this, as Catson and Bones are both very reliable and honest characters. The baddies are played by rats, who definitely don't get a good press, do they? But yeah, I mean, it's that relationship between Holmes and Watson obviously translates well into a cat dog version of it. It's a kind of relationship that you can just write endlessly to. It's such a simple formula that Holmes knows just that bit more than Watson, and Watson's relating it in the first person for most of the stories. It's a simple formula, and it's so associated with that relationship that you can see it when other fictional pairings recreate it. So sometimes it's good just to kind of riff on that relationship. I mean, Conan Doyle himself wanted to stop writing the Sherlock Holmes stories, and they became a bit of an albatross for him. But the fans insisted that he had to keep on going and bring Sherlock Holmes back from the dead. And Conan Doyle was kind of an early book vlogger, because there's this footage of him on YouTube being interviewed, and he talks a little bit about Sherlock Holmes. What he really wants to talk about is his spiritualism, because he feels that's what he'll be remembered for. And of course, now we know with those views seem very eccentric to us, but we're glad that he took a few minutes out to tell us about Sherlock Holmes. Although he does describe Watson in the video. He describes Watson as quite stupid, which is surprising, really, because a lot of Sherlock Holmes fans wouldn't really say that about Watson. So it's interesting. It's interesting that Conan Doyle himself would say that. But he seems kind of tired of Holmes and Watson by that stage of his life, kind of hounded by a fandom when he wants to move on to other things, like when sci-fi TV actors say, ask me about my theatre work. You get the impression he's been asked about it a lot and would rather talk about something else by that point.
Oh, it's one of the first, what do you call it? Like toxic parasocial relationships between.
Yeah, that's right. The first toxic fandom. Yeah, it probably was. I mean, he had to bring him back from the dead, didn't he? And it's also one of the first very highly parodied literary forms, which just shows that it's something about that dynamic where you read it and it's kind of just an invitation to write to it as well. Like some relationships between characters, they kind of, it's no wonder they inspired this early fan fiction, because it's just a formula that you want to have a go at whenever you read it, really.
And to add on to it being like a generational thing too, there's an entire generation that's going to look at we were just talking about Benedict Cumberbatch and be like, oh, that's Sherlock Holmes. No matter how many movies he's in, you're gonna be like, that's Sherlock Holmes. So that's where like the generational thing comes into play.
Yeah, I loved that BBC series of it, and the fact that they embraced technology, because a lot of the time, if you were writing a thriller, you want a kind of disabled technology in some way, don't you? If you were writing something where the characters could solve things via Google or by phoning someone. You want that scene. Oh, no signal, so we'll just have to really play out this plot as though we lived in a pre-mobile phone world. But I love the fact that they went for it and really embraced the technology. It feels like the braver thing to do than just pretend it doesn't work for the sake of being able to plot it more conveniently.
I do always respect horror movies that, don't dispose of the cell phones first, because it's harder to write, So I do appreciate that Sherlock does that too.
And so many great horror films would have been just ruined by mobile phones. They'd have just been over in 3 minutes, wouldn't they? So.
That actually is a great segue into one of my other questions. How did you write these books? Like, did you come up with the ending first? Did you kind of figure it out as you went along and just meander your way around?
Well, I think if it's a whodunit, you do have to come up with the ending first. But not. I'm kind of. If I left to my own devices, I would kind of be a pantser rather than a plotter and just go along with it. But I think if it's a whodunit, you really have to know where you're going, or you could have a few possibilities, like the film Clue has those 3 or 4 different endings. You could have a few possibilities and then plump for one as you're writing it. But you have to have something to write backwards to, I think, if you do a whodunit. Although these are the only ones I've done in strict whodunit format. So I haven't had a lot of experience before this, but I thought you definitely need to. If you don't know it at first, you'd have to go back and redraft it to plant the clues very carefully if you didn't know who did it all along. I mean, one of the puzzles in this book is that you kind of see a spread of a newspaper article, and the text is quite small. So I'm thinking, most young readers won't actually bother reading all the text. They'll just look for the clues in the puzzle. But if they did read the text, they'd find some little Easter eggs in there. So it's nice to be able to put those things in as you're writing it. But yeah, I think you probably do need a little bit more discipline in this particular subgenre than you would in, like, there are probably other types of crime or thriller where you wouldn't need to plot it as much, but I think you'd have to have it quite well plotted out to do a whodunit. I mean this particular book, unlike the other ones in the series, the first one, The Crown Jewels one, is split up into 3 quite distinctive segments, because at first I was thinking of doing like a branching thing with it as well, so that the reader could actually choose who the reader could choose who they think was the culprit. But then that on top of the puzzles just became a little bit inaccessible. So I rewrote it as a much more linear narrative, but with the puzzles branching off from it.
I really like how the puzzles and the games flow so nicely with the text. And as I was reading, it kind of occurred to me that mystery is probably already one of the more interactive genres, because it is sort of encouraging you to, try to figure out things as you're reading, to try to anticipate the twist before you get there, to figure it out before the character does. And so adding games to that really seems like it's just a really great way to suck in a child reader, it's just, there's so much for them to grab onto. Did you did you pick a mystery genre for that reason, or was it just something that you kind of wanted to explore for this project?
I was a highlight kid generation, and that's what that heavily reminded me of, the highlight magazines.
Oh yeah, I mean it's no, I mean, thanks for pointing it out. I hadn't really thought of it that way before, but I mean you're absolutely right that every detective story is a puzzle, and every clue you plant is a mini puzzle. I think putting actual physical puzzles in is just a way to communicate to children that this is the kind of, if you like that kind of thinking, if you like riddles, and if you like working things out, then try the detective genre. So I think but yeah, I mean if you can ever find the time to sit down and read an Agatha Christie in one sitting, then it is a puzzle that plays out over the the few hours that you sit down and read it. It is like just a huge riddle that you've got to solve, and you get the same buzz from it that you would from getting a lateral thinking puzzle right, or just somehow managing to slot it all into place in your mind. And you feel great if you do it, and then a bit disappointed with yourself if you don't.
It's like when you watch Scooby-Doo and you're like, he's the one who did it.
Yeah.
So, keep it in the children's genre.
Yeah, well, like the fourth one of these, which I don't think is out in the US yet, but hopefully will be coming out, is much more in the Scooby-Doo genre, where apparently supernatural things are happening, and of course, Sherlock Bones only wants a rational explanation for it, but Catson gets a little bit spooked by what's going on. But I mean, the weird thing is that Sherlock Holmes' character in stories like the Sussex Vampire is very rational, and he's looking for logical explanations. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, was into loads of supernatural explanations. He thought the Cottingley fairies were real, the prank played by the two schoolgirls who lived near Leeds, and made made the fairy cutouts in their garden and photographed them with their dad's Brownie box camera, and then was published in a magazine. And because Conan Doyle and so many eminent Edwardians thought they were real, they had to keep the lie up for the whole of their lives. So they were in their 80s and 90s, I think, by the time they came out and admitted it was a hoax. But they had to live with this lie for so long because so many respected people believed they were genuine pictures. And you look at it now and you think, how could anyone have thought they were genuine pictures? But this was the infancy of photography, so people weren't used to looking at doctored photographs, and it was before Photoshop, when now we don't believe anything is real. But it was in the very early days of that, enough people believed it was real that they had to keep it up. So yeah, it's a strange thing, isn't it, when to mention that the relationship between supernatural elements and detective fiction in children's stuff. I mean, for the sake of not giving them nightmares, if you're going to do something like that, it does end up being Scooby-Doo, where the supernatural isn't real at the end of it, and everything's all right.
Yeah. And it kind of makes it like a safe way to explore those genres that, might appeal to you when you're older, but that maybe, you're not quite ready for, so I loved mysteries, and I loved the supernatural aspects of Scooby-Doo, and, that prepped me for like X-Files and like other stuff down the line, and books too. I read books.
Yeah, I was thinking Goosebumps with R.L. Stein, terrified me as a kid, but now I'm ready for Stephen King.
But the weird thing when I was growing up is there was enough people that you had access to that really believed in the supernatural that it was hard to tell. Like it was hard to take comfort from things like Scooby-Doo when you had things like the Usborne Book of Ghosts, which was in the non-fiction section of the library, and it was written as though ghosts were real. The conceit of the whole thing was here are some poltergeists you might spot, as you go about your daily life. You'd have things like Arthur C. Clarke's World of the Unexplained on TV, and it was incredibly mainstream belief then, and it still is now to an extent, but it's a little bit more fringe. But it was very much part of mainstream culture then that ghosts were real, and you may encounter one. So Scooby-Doo wasn't really much comfort in the light of all that zeitgeist.
Oh gosh, yeah, that is fascinating. I do really like the way that like Sherlock Holmes as a figure has sort of been like reinterpreted over time, and like the way he's characterized kind of always has something to do with like how we envision genius, or how we think like genius should act or look, so like I don't think it's a coincidence that like Benedict Cumberbatch like 10 to 15 years ago was like the smartest guy in the room, but also like the biggest jerk you've ever met, like that's kind of like we kind of live in that era where like most of the smartest guys are kind of jerks too. But that's not at all what like original Holmes was like too, so like what went into crafting your like Holmes Jr., like what was it like writing a children's version of him?
Yeah, especially because I feel like they still have a lot of animalistic qualities to them. Like in the beginning of the Crown Jewels, he's sitting in his home and he's like chewing on his chew toys, and I think that's the funniest thing.
Yeah, I mean, and when they were interviewing one of the politicians in the newspaper article, he goes, "No, if you'll excuse me, I have a stick to catch," as though that's his excuse for getting out of the interview. But yeah, I mean, if you're doing an animal version of something, then you can find a juxtaposition in animal and human behavior. When you're writing humorous stuff for this age group, it's good to find a juxtaposition to hang on to, because bringing two different worlds together is a good path towards writing gags. I mean, puns are a good path towards writing gags as well, but not much use if you sell it to foreign translation and they can't translate the puns, and they don't know what to do with Barker Street instead of Baker Street, for example. But if you can have a good solid bit of juxtaposition, then that's something you can write to, and that will translate into different languages as well. I mean, the first, as I said, the first book I did was about the first children's book I did was about a wimpy vampire, and of course you're writing to a juxtaposition there. So you want a contradiction in every character, don't you? And sometimes a contradiction can give you great drama and a Shakespearean fatal flaw, but sometimes it can just be a way of bringing together something high and something mundane for an easy comic effect.
Absolutely. And it also renders it like a little accessible for kids too, because yes, most kids know who Sherlock Holmes is, but when you're introducing like classic literature, drawing it in the terms of like the animal world perhaps renders it a little bit more familiar and like helps the classic literature bit go down a little bit smoother too,
Yeah, hopefully they get a taste for classic literature by looking at the animal parodies. Like what was the Disney film Oliver and Company? That's kind of and of course probably the best example would be Muppets Christmas Carol, wasn't it? Where you're doing this sort of fantastical comedy version of it, but you're hopefully piquing an interest in the classics, which will return to them. I mean, Muppets Christmas Carol is probably the adaptation of Christmas Carol which keeps the most Dickens in it. I mean, there's direct quotes from Dickens. There's a narration. It may be Muppets aside, it may be the most faithful adaptation of it. So that's probably as good a pathway as you could ask for how to introduce classics to children without them realizing that that's what you're doing.
True. And I can draw a direct line in between like watching the Disney Robin Hood as a child and then like getting a PhD in medieval literature in 2020. So, that stuff can be influential.
I mean, I suppose whatever you do in life, you can trace it back to something in childhood, and sometimes you can kind of construct a narrative based on the million things that you were interested in. But I do look back at certain things that struck me as a child, and they never really leave you, do they? They kind of when something grabs you at that early age, it really stays with you. Which is, of course, why it's such a privilege to write for this young age group. You could fire up an interest that shapes someone's life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we also give a quick shout out to your illustrator?
Oh, yeah,
love pictures throughout it. Is this your first time working with him?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, John Bigwood, he's worked a lot with this publisher before, and it's the first time I've done stuff with him. And yeah, it really made me laugh. And of course, it's a very tricky job for him because he had to draw the puzzles as well. And so sometimes he'll be working from quite lengthy descriptions of what has to be in the puzzle. So it's quite a fiddly job for an illustrator, but he did a good job with it. Try not to be too mean to your illustrators, don't you? Try not to put in like huge crowd scenes that need illustrating and things like that. But I think in the case of puzzles, you've just got to be pretty merciless, like these sort of huge arrangements of jewels and things, which then becomes a puzzle when the reader has to match them to other groups of jewels. So it's quite a tough job for an illustrator doing the puzzles, but he's done a great job with it.
Oh, nice. So there's a few books in the series, not all of which are out in the US yet, but they're coming. Do you have anything else in the works? Are you working on anything else for children or otherwise, or what's on your horizon?
Well, hopefully there'll be another puzzle series coming along soon, which has been developed at the moment, but I don't think it's been announced yet. I mean, there's still a series I did called the Secret Diary, Long Lost Secret Diary of the World's Worst, and then each title was a different one. Did come out in the US, and that should still hopefully be in some libraries and on shelves there. And then I've got a few non-fiction things coming up. some nonfiction for adults as well. So should be quite a busy year. Hopefully, I can never remember what's been announced and what hasn't, to be honest.
Well, I hope you'll consider coming back to talk to us for one of those feature projects, because this has been great, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear about these books. They're really just very adorable and a lot of fun, and I can't wait to give them to the kids in my life.
Oh,
Happy
great!
depicting.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're so welcome. All right, everybody, thank you for joining us. This has been Jen and my colleague,
Melissa.
signing off. Please pick up Sherlock Bones, the series, all of them. Just get all of them. Pre-order the ones that don't exist yet and the ones that do. It is now time to close this chapter. Goodbye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.